Good evening, Fiji, and welcome to For the Record. Well, this evening we'll talk about an issue that is important to us all here in Fiji. After all, we are a nation of islands. This evening we're being joined by Mr. Neil Slack, the Chief Executive Officer of the Maritime Safety Authority of Fiji. Thank you very much for joining us this evening, and Happy New Year to you.
Likewise, and to the viewers as well. Good evening.
Now, you've had an interesting journey to Fiji.
Yes.
Before we even talk about the Maritime Safety Authority of Fiji, let's talk about you for just a little bit so that our viewers can understand who exactly you are. Now, you've shared with this with me, and I'd love for Fiji to hear about this. Now, how did you get to Fiji?
I'm a Bible-believing Christian, was invited into Fiji by a couple of pastors. One has lived here, an American chap now, a Fiji citizen for about 15 years. Mm-hmm. In 2006, early in December, I was invited to come in here to assist them with some projects, some Christian projects that related to schools, orphanages and free and aid medical clinics, and with some of the changes that happened internationally, that funding had stalled, and I was seeking out other opportunities, set up a consulting business here in Fiji, was supporting also the Forum Fisheries Agency in Honiara, consulting on tuna management into the Pacific nations, and a couple of years ago applied for the role as CEO of the Maritime Safety Authority of Fiji with the intent, as I mentioned to you off screen earlier, with the intention I've come to Fiji not to take, not to patronise, not as an Aussie to tell people how to do it, but to come in and provide advice, to learn, and to aid the growth and development of the maritime industry. And I can't think of a better way to do so than through the regulator, the Maritime Safety Authority of Fiji, and the approach that we're taking is enablement of compliance to that legislation. So I'm not a hired gun, I'm not leaving in 3 years. I am a citizen of Fiji, and I'm proud to call myself a Fiji citizen.
You also are pursuing tertiary studies, you said?
Yes, a couple of years ago I started a PhD at USP with Professor Gurmit Singh as my supervisor. I have about 2 years to complete on that. The thesis is titled The Change Management Challenges of the Reform of the Maritime Safety Authority of Fiji. And really I believe what that'll do is give insight into reform of government departments to commercial statutory authorities like MSAF, not just insight into this industry, but aid the government when they are transitioning other government departments to government commercial statutory authorities, what to do and definitely what not to do, because there's been some bumps in the road. We've learned from that. And it's interesting because what I've seen throughout that analysis, and obviously it's confidential at this stage and not been released, but the transition from the previous authority or administrator, the Fiji Islands Maritime Safety Administration, or PHMSA as everybody would know that, was a highly hierarchical, centralised control and decision making, limited delegation. 85% of all staff were based in Suva and Lautoka offices, but 85% of the industry is not in those two locations. No. Deployed staff that were relatively untrained or underqualified for the roles that they had, ad hoc training across the organisation, paper-based systems predominantly, difficulty in analysing data because it was paper-based, and generally a morale that was somewhat low. But the converse of that is having highly qualified and experienced technical officers that were hamstrung somewhat by the infrastructure that was in place. So with the transition and the decision in November 2011 by the government, with the introduction of the Maritime Safety Authority of Fiji Decree of 2009, it meant that what was the task at hand for us to become more effective, more efficient, more productive in the way in which we operated, more transparent, and ultimately to deliver a service that's customer focused as opposed to basically going through the motions somewhat and applying legislation without a focus on the human aspect of it, which is necessary to enable compliance.
Exactly. Now 2011, that's when it was established. Now to 2013 last year.
Yes.
What has it been like for those 2 years, especially for your staff?
Yes.
With, obviously there have been changes.
Massive change. I've been involved, and part of my history and experience is in reform of large organisations and multinational organisations, and it's never easy.
No.
And the greatest challenge always is not the restructuring of the organisation. That can be done over a number of actions and over a number of years, but it's always the human aspect of it, because at the end of the day, with any change, you need the hearts and minds of the individuals involved.
Exactly.
Early on, there was a lot of change happening, and we could have been better at the way in which we communicated that to staff and to industry. What we've learnt over the 2 years is there's never enough awareness and there's never enough communication, and oftentimes people think of communication as talking. It's not talking. The first aspect to communication is listening, because to have an informed response, you need to understand the position of the person that you're communicating with. When I first joined the authority in the first week, I undertook a tour of Fiji, and I thought that was very, very important to basically not hide in an office and say, I'm a CEO and I sign checks and other mandates that may come from a great height, because my approach to management is very much management by walking around, roll up the sleeves and get down into the trenches and not stand there and direct an order. It doesn't work. So travelled the nation, set up a series of meetings with our prime stakeholder groups. There was about a dozen of those. And what I realised in the initial meetings, and I remember one particularly well in Denarau, because I was told by one of our senior staff that there would be a couple of stakeholders attending the meeting. I walked into the general manager of Port Denarau, Nigel Skegg's boardroom, somewhat flabbergasted to realise there were 40 stakeholders in the room. They provided a log of claims, so to speak, of all the complaints over the last couple of years, realising my background is not in maritime safety. But having said that, I'm not a fool. I have vast and wide-ranging experience and qualifications across a range of different industries, having worked in Australasia and obviously Southeast Asia and other parts of the world. And at the outset of the meeting, prayed, which I thought was unusual for a number of these individuals, because I could see they were looking around thinking, what do we do? And Nigel, sitting a couple of seats up on my left-hand side, asked the question. He said, do you mind if we go through the email that I actually provided to you a couple of days ago? And I said, with respect, it's all history. We need to rewrite history, and part of that is changing the interface between the regulator, ourselves, and obviously the industry. And this should be a starting point, and that would be my intentions, if you're agreeable. And he said, what do you mean by that? I said, let's put that aside and look at what is the rapport and the relationship that should exist between the regulator, MSAF, and the industry. Because the previous relationship between PHMSA and the industry was industry and external was PHMSA. And I explained at length to those representatives there.
I'm going to have to interrupt you here because we've just run out of time for this segment, but we'll be right back with this interesting issue with the CEO of MSAF, Mr. Neil Slack. Welcome back to For the Record. Now, just before the break, yes, MSAF CEO with us, Mr. Neil Slack, and we were just talking about, MSAF being relatively new, established in 2011. Now, how was the response from the different stakeholders who are involved with MSAF? And you were just mentioning your very first meeting.
I believe somewhat cautious, because if you've been treated in a particular way, which was very much as a regulator, here's legislation, comply, do not complain. When I'm coming in waving the white flag and saying, listen, at the end of the day, it's not regulator and industry as separate entities. We are part of the industry. We're a critical aspect of that, whether it's a training provider, whether it's the regulator, whether it's the industry stakeholders and the subsectors of them. Each of us have different needs, different requirements and different functions, but at the end of the day, there is one industry, we're all part of it. And at the end of the day, it's ideal if we can work together, and that's the greatest desire. And that was the intention of and the output of that meeting, there was an agreement to that. But the recommendation I made to that group and all others was, whilst there's a fragmented group of, in that instance, 40 stakeholders, the recommendation was that they form some form of association where I'm dealing with individual representatives of those sub-entities of the industry, because I did state in that meeting, if every one of you emailed me once a day, as did every stakeholder across the country, nothing would change, because all I'd be doing is responding to emails. So they took heed of that. Each of these groups have appointed a particular representative of the group, and that's who I deal with now. And we're finding that to be quite an effective mode of communication and moving this change forward.
A lot more effective, I can imagine. Yes. Now, obviously, the response from then, from 2011 to 2013, you've got 2014 ahead of us now. What has been, relatively, how have you been faring?
It's been exceptionally challenging for industry and ourselves. We have legislation, the Marine Act of 1986 and the Maritime Regulations of 1990. Any legislation that's in excess of 20 years old, which it all is challenging for the industry and for ourselves as the regulator to enforce. So working with the stakeholders from, it was June of 2011, Cabinet endorsed a review committee for the review of the Marine Act of 1986 and the regulations of 1990. We've been actively involved in that, and over the last 2 years, been actively engaging with stakeholders in the review of that legislation, public and stakeholder, wide-ranging, to all and most parts of Fiji, to seek out and understand what the needs of the smallest fibre boat operator is, up to the largest tourism operators and roll-on, roll-off vessel operators and cargo operators in the country is, because they are very, very different. But overwhelmingly, seek out their advice. We've drafted that into the legislation, which will come into effect, has been endorsed by Cabinet, gazetted, and will come into effect on the 5th of March 2014, which is the Maritime Transport Decree.
Not too far away.
Not too far away. And the Ship Registration Decree, both of 2013. And we would expect, and I believe reasonably so, because the wide-ranging and public consultation undertaken, it was so extensive. If we ask what you need, and we've drafted that into the legislation, we would expect when we bring back our legislation that there would be a high level of voluntary compliance to it. There will be a number of challenges still, because in that legislation we've introduced 7 new international maritime or IMO obligations, which has really lifted the bar in terms of degree of complexity and difficulty, and really bringing our nation into line with most other maritime nations and nations that are members of IMO, with legislation that is internationally of an international standard, and that's what we're working toward.
Now, our Maritime Act, it's long overdue, from 1986 now, 2000, and which we got the decree into this year, 2014. With these new compliances that you've said that we'll introduce, sort of puts our country we're in sort of a little bit of a leader, so to speak, in our region.
Well, very much in the Pacific region, and we're rubbing shoulders, so to speak, with the best in the world, because as we introduce this, the legislation is internationally recognised through the IMO. It is adopted in many nations. I think there's 170-something nations as member states of the IMO. And even just most recently, I attended the International Maritime Organisation General Assembly in December with the Deputy Secretary of Transport and Energy from our ministry, Line Ministry, Works, Transport and Public Utilities, and we met with the senior officials of the IMO, the Secretary General, and what was made abundantly clear to us, they deem and can see the massive inroads and improvements we've made over the last 2 years. They acknowledge that publicly. The support that they've committed to us in the coming years through their integrated technical cooperation program. We welcome with open arms, because at the end of the day, we don't need financial support. We need the technical support to enable us to comply to these international obligations. they've committed that to us, even to the extent whereby IMO have approached us about becoming the host country, and obviously the Maritime Safety Authority of Fiji, the host authority, for supporting them with hosting training programs in the Pacific as well. And my view of that is that's a vote of confidence in the improvements and inroads that we've made to date. But having said that, we've got a lot of hard yards still to make, because at the end of the day, our approach is not enforcing and just regulating compliance. If there's challenges out there that any of the operators and vessel owners and masters are experiencing, we need to know that, and we need to work through if there's further changes to the legislation, which there will. It's imperative that we ensure that the legislation keeps pace with the changes in the International Maritime Organisation updated obligations, such that the legislation in a year or two's time, we're not sitting here saying it's now outdated and not applicable and how do we enforce it and so forth. So we've introduced within our own organisation a department called Standards and Conformance, and we have a manager heading that up that'll deal with not just the IMO, the International Hydrography Organisation, IALA, which is the International Association in relation to lighthouses, the Tokyo MOU, which is looking at port state control. We're really building not just local interface and enablement approach to our local stakeholders, but also the interface with these international organisations that we're members of, but have never really taken advantage and opportunity of what's on offer from them, which is technical support that's wide-ranging and is there at limited to no cost to us.
Thank you very much, Mr. Slack. We'll go for a short break, but we'll be right back on For the Record. Welcome back to For the Record. With us this evening, the CEO of MSEF, Mr. Neil Slack. Now, just before we hit the break, we were talking about, well, the transition, the challenges that you've had so far. Now, let's talk about the decree that will be in place this year. A lot of awareness going on, obviously, with MSEF. What changes will these bring to the regular boat owner?
There's actually two decrees, the Maritime Transport Decree, and that's in relation to regulation of safety on ships and obviously cargo and passengers and so forth, and protection of the marine environment. The key aspect of change that brings is 7 IMO, International Maritime Organisation obligations, massive change and wide-ranging. The most complex of that would be in relation to maritime pollution and the processing of discharges and ensuring that we protect our marine environment. That'll be the most challenging to ourselves and obviously to the industry when vessels are docking and so forth, that they are discharging waste and not just dropping it into the harbour or wherever. There's also looking at all vessels need to be compliant, as the ship registration decree requires. Every vessel must comply. We know that currently there's probably about, our estimates probably pretty good, about 2,000 small commercial craft operating out there illegally in terms of not being surveyed, not being registered. And if we look at the challenges that we have with drownings and so forth, and we see within this country, predominantly it's in that area. So what we've done to assist with that compliance, not just of small craft, but all vessels, pleasure craft as well, that currently are not required under the current legislation to comply. Under the new legislation, the Ship Registration Decree will require all craft to be compliant. So focusing specifically on the smaller craft, it's very, very important that they do work with us. What have we done to enable them? Because our function is to enable. In September, we approached Cabinet. They endorsed 3 regulations to come into effect until March 5 that relate to a reduction in fees by about 70% of the survey, registration and coasting trading licence for those vessels. And that's our way of saying to those small commercial operators, please don't run away and not comply. We are here to assist you. It's not about revenue for the authority, it's about ensuring that we can enhance maritime safety, security and protection of the marine environment. We've seen the volume of small craft surveys and registrations escalating since those 3 regulations were endorsed by Cabinet, and we would see into the future we'll continue to work with the stakeholders in those areas. Obviously penalties, there's penalty regimes in both the MTD and the SRD, and they are wide-ranging, they are massive, and the reason they are massive or enormous is as a deterrent factor, because at the end of the day, this is about maritime safety. This is about protection of vessel, cargo, passengers, crew, life at sea, safety of life at sea, and that's our highest priority. So if penalties are high, there's spot fines that'll be introduced as well, and what's the intention of that? Is to drive an awareness that if you are considering not to comply with the legislation, please think twice, because the ramifications are wide-ranging.
Now, apart from the certification, what else can the public do in terms of ensuring that these vessels comply?
What they can do is work with us. We've also introduced 3 mobile awareness and survey teams, because during the public and stakeholder consultations, what I heard firsthand, because I participated in most, was we need time to comply. That's why the legislation, even though it was gazetted in 2013, it's not coming into effect well after that, to March 5 of 2014. They need time to save. They said, bring the services to us, because I've already mentioned we were very much centralised. We're decentralising surveyors into the north. There's been a surveyor decentralised and staff into Savu. We'll also be decentralising more staff into Lambasa. We've decentralised already staff into Lautoka, and also setting up offices this year in 2014, no different to the standard that we have at Kandavu House in Lautoka and Denarau. And the 3 mobile teams will be operating out of the 4 major divisions, but more so in the more remote locations, because we need to take the service there, real-time, mobile, in-situ delivery of service. And we need to set up the infrastructure technically, so the IT infrastructure to support that. We don't have that in place yet, and we'd expect by mid-year of 2014 we will, but those mobile teams will be out there from this month providing those services.
That sounds very good. Now, all this, with the MSEF being the authority on maritime safety, what do you see as your next challenge? Now, I know that there's still a lot that we need to be reached. So, what do you foresee, like the immediate challenge?
In-house training, without a doubt. As the bar has been lifted with the introduction of 7 IMO obligations coming into this legislation, it's the training of our own staff in due process and the need to follow due process, because with the MTD and the SRD coming into effect, they're even-handed documents, meaning it's not regulator, we tell industry, you comply. If we don't meet the requirements of the legislation ourselves, we can be and should be taken to task by the stakeholders if we in any way adversely impact their business and operations if we've not complied to the letter of the law. So the immediate greatest need for us is that, and also in line and in parallel with that is awareness of the change of legislation and this ongoing enablement of all stakeholders to comply, and getting the message out there. The big brother days, the big stick approach, the regulator is gone. And we need to and want to and desire to work more closely with you. But overlaying all of that is a change of culture within the authority, and that takes time, and also a change of culture within the industry, that they will be truthful and honest with us when something goes wrong, that we're not chasing phantoms, that we're chasing real challenges, and at the end of the day, that it's not us and them. We're here, it is a maritime nation, we all love this nation, we need to protect the resources, the maritime resources. At the end of the day, we know the extent of delivery of foreign funds that are driven into the country through the tourism industry and the other segments of this industry, and we're a critical part of ensuring that we support that and the growth of this great country, Fiji.
Thank you very much. Mr. Neil Slack, the Chief Executive Officer of MSIF, thank you for making time for us this evening. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. Obviously, we'd love to have you explain a whole lot more, but thank you again for tuning in this evening, ladies and gentlemen, and join us again next week. If you do have questions or comments, please send them through to our email address, fortherecord@fbc.com.fj. We'll see you again next week. Good night, Fiji.